In this video, we're going to go over another more advanced feature in Excel related to formulas and functions and some of the material that we just went over in the previous videos here, and that is pivot tables. So you might have heard of the concept of a pivot table before, but you might not know exactly what it means. You might not know exactly how to use it. A lot of people actually working full-time in investment banking and private equity don't even really know how to use pivot tables effectively. And if you talk to them about it, will say that they've seen these tables before and seen them used in worksheets and models, but they don't really understand them. They don't understand what the point is and what they do. So I'm going to go over that right now and start out with a brief overview of why we use them and how they're useful, and then go into an example of how you create your own, and then give you an exercise so that you can learn the concepts and how to create them as well. You could do something as simple as, for example, summing up all the customers. So we could have Buster's, Cindy's, Dave's, Holly's, Smith's, and so on and so forth down here. And we could list the total revenue per customer. We could go in and go to product category. So we could go to customer, planning, inventory, and we could just list those at the bottom right here. And then we could list the total revenue by category. So that's one thing that a pivot table would let us do. And you might be wondering, based on that, why do we use pivot tables? I mean, it seems pretty simple to be doing that just within this table, because we have all our customer data over here in our lookup table, and we could pretty easily summarize some of what I just went through with a few basic formulas right here in this table. So why is it that we actually use pivot tables? And the short answer is that that's one thing that pivot tables let us do, summarize the data. But the more useful aspects of pivot tables are that they let us easily rearrange the data and cut it without having to re-enter formulas all the time. So for example, let's say that we had customers arranged by industry, or let's say, for example, that we had industry, and then we had customers listed right here. So we had travel, and then Cindy's, and then Sydney's, and so on. And for the time being, we're looking at it first by industry, and then by customer, and then by total revenue. So we basically have total revenue by customer, and then we can see total revenue by industry. So we could do that in Excel like this. But let's say we want to look at customer by industry, and then give the total revenue like that. So the total revenue by industry by customer. So doing it in the reverse order right here. Well, if we wanted to do that, then it would take some work, because we'd have to go in and rearrange all the formulas and everything. Whereas with a pivot table, we could just click and drag these two categories with the mouse and instantly have everything rearranged and working. So the pivot table lets us easily rearrange our data analysis and lets us look at it in a lot of different ways very easily. The other advantage of a pivot table is that it lets us do additional calculations. So for example, in this data, you'll see that I've added an invoice amount and a payment amount category. So the invoice amount is actually just product price times product quantity, but the payment amount is how much the customer has actually paid for this given order. So let's say we want to find the balance of these two categories, and we want to look at the balance by customer. Well, we could go in and manually add all the formulas to subtract payment amount from invoice amount, and that would be one approach. And then we could try to summarize it by using lookup or by using other formulas that we went over in Excel. But if we used a pivot table in this case, it would make it much easier and we could get it done much more quickly. So that's basically why we use pivot tables in Excel. You typically don't use them when you're working with models. It's mostly with data sets like this, with customer due diligence data, that sort of data and those sorts of files in Excel where you use pivot tables the most. So let's go through a quick example right now of how to create our own pivot table within Excel. And there are some differences between Excel 2003 and Excel 2007 with this feature. So I'm going to go through it, and I'm using Excel 2007 right now, but I'll go through the differences with 2003 and how some of the different items and some of the options may appear slightly differently. So first things first, let's just select this whole area with Shift Control down arrow key and right arrow key. Now to get to the pivot table menu, we press Alt D P. So Alt D gets us to data, and then Alt D P gets us to pivot table. So we get to this pivot table and pivot chart wizard. We have a couple different options here. And our data is all in Excel. If we were pulling it in from a notepad file or from a database or something like that that a client sent us, then we might go to external data source. That gets a lot more complicated, and you hardly ever use that because 99% of the time your data is going to be in Excel. So we're just going to stick to the first option here for Microsoft Office Excel list or database. And then for the type of report, we're just going to stick to the basic pivot table. We can create charts and all sorts of other reports, but in most cases in investment banking, you're going to be just using the pivot tables. You don't really care about looking at charts most of the time, so we're just going to stick with the first option right here. We'll hit Alt-N for next. And then we see that where's the data you want to use. So we've already selected this whole area from A1 to I-22, from customer name down to this last bottom right corner here. So this is all correct. Now we hit Alt-N for next. Now, where do you want to put the pivot table report? So we have a couple different options. We could create a new worksheet. We could use an existing worksheet. So we could just put the pivot table data in order data here right below the actual data. Typically with pivot tables, it's better to create a new worksheet because that way it's just easier to separate things. It's easier to, when you're modifying a worksheet, it's easier to make sure that nothing is getting messed up when you're adding or deleting rows or columns if everything is in a separate worksheet. So it's typically best to create a separate worksheet, and that's what we're going to do here. So we'll just hit Alt-F for finish. Okay, now we get this interface for adding in our items into our pivot table right here. So I'll go through and explain what each of these actually means right now. And first off, I should point out that in Excel 2003, this interface looks a bit different. Instead of appearing in Excel directly, it'll appear in a dialog box. So you'll get something looking like this, except it'll appear in a dialog box, like the ones that we were just going through. So the appearance will be a bit different, but the functionality is the same. So keep that in mind in case you're using Excel 2003 here. So the data items right here, this is basically where the calculations are going to be taking place for our pivot table. So data items, this is where we'd be summing up the revenue per customer, for example. So right here, this is where we'd be summing up the invoice amounts, or this is where we'd be summing up the payment amounts. The row fields are the different categories that we want to look at here. So when we want to look at payment amounts by product category, or perhaps by industry, or perhaps by customer, that is where we'd be entering that. And then the column fields, that's just another way to view the data, but it's basically the same thing. You're basically looking at the different categories that you want to view the payment amounts or the invoice amounts by here. So the column fields and the row fields are basically for the different categories by which you want to view the data. And then the data items, the drop data items here area right in the center is for the different calculations, the different sums and products that you want to perform right here. Now the page fields at the top right here, the drop page fields here, we're not really going to use that in this one, but this would be used, for example, if you're moving through a large data set over months or years, and let's say that you only want to look at 1 month or 1 year at a time, then you would put that type of field up here, and you could specify and say, I only want to look at February, or I only want to look at March. And what we'd have to do in that case is actually add in a category here, and we'd have to add in the month or year. And that would be, for example, if this extended from 2000 to 2010 over each month in between, then we'd probably add in categories for months and years just to make it easier to do that. So that's the basics of how you set it up. And then to actually get this working, we can actually use the mouse here. This is one of the few times in Excel where it's actually fine to use the mouse, and it's probably the easiest method. So let's start by adding customer name. So I'm just going to go to customer name over here and click on this and then drag this to the row fields, the drop row fields here. We see that we get all the different customer names. So each of these is unique. So it's allowing us to basically view payment amount, invoice amount, and other fields by customer name. Now if we wanted to, we could just go in and drop in employees by customer name. This would not make too much sense here because you see at the bottom what we're really doing is sum of number of employees, which doesn't really make any sense in this context because each company has a certain number of employees. We never sum up the employees across different orders per company or anything like that. So we'll just uncheck that. And then another thing that we could do here is we could add a category at the top here for drop column fields right here. Well, I'm going to add in industry. So I just clicked on industry and dragged it over. Now, in this case, industry is not particularly useful because if we look at the data, control page down to move over, we see that for the most part, there aren't too many different industries. It seems to be mostly one customer's in one industry, and travel is repeated because we have a couple different companies there. But for the other ones here, it's not too useful. We do have a repeat for fashion, but aside from those, it's not terribly useful here. But nevertheless, we're just going to do it for now so you can see how this works. And then what we're going to do is in the middle, we're going to add in invoice amount. So I'll click on invoice amount with the left mouse button and then drag it over. Okay. So I'll just close this pivot table field list now. And again, in Excel 2003, this looks slightly different. This would all be in a dialog box instead. So we'd be doing this in a dialog and then hit finish to get to this finished version right here. So now we see that we've summarized this. And we see a couple different categories. So we see travel appears twice, like I said, the fashion appears twice. And what it's basically doing here is we're summing up the invoice amount per customer. And then we're also summing at the bottom here the invoice amount per industry. So that's a very simple way that we can use a pivot table like that. Now, another thing that we can do, another way that we can use this may not seem too spectacular to you because we're not doing anything particularly complicated. We're just looking at total revenue by customer and then total revenue by industry here at the bottom. But another way that we can use a pivot table, and actually the reason why it's called a pivot table, is that we can use the mouse and go to this industry category, and what we can do is drag it, and we can position it right over here on the left side of the screen. And so now what we've done is we've pivoted the table so that now we're looking at industry first and then customer, and then we're looking at the total by industry right here, construction total, entertainment total, fashion total, and then we're looking at the individual customers within each of those industries right here. So you see how this is useful. We can easily move around the data like this and easily go in and modify it and look at different cuts and do different types of analysis depending on what we care about at the moment. And now I'm going to go back in and change around what we're doing slightly. So I'm going to hit the right mouse button. You can either hit it on your keyboard or just literally click the right mouse button here. I'm going to go to show field list. I'm going to press D to get down there. And now I get this pivot table field list over here on the right side of the screen again. And so this time what I want to do is uncheck industry. And instead I'm going to display price. So I'm going to go and drag price over up here to the top area. And now we see we have a different cut of the data. So now it's showing us basically each of the different prices that customers have placed orders at. And again, we're looking at a quick summary by customer. So it's summing up the customers over here in column P. And then we're also looking at a summary by price down here. So that's how we do that. And this data doesn't look very pretty right now. So to fix this, to fix the formatting here, we can actually go to the top and click on Pivot Table Tools. In Excel 2003, this will show up as a button on the side of your screen in most cases, but you should see some kind of Pivot Table Tools or Pivot Table options on your screen if you're using Excel 2003. We can go to Field Settings right here. Go to Field Settings right here, and we can hit Tab a couple times and go to Show. And we can go to number format right here. You just press Alt-N to get there. And here you see we have the option to change the formatting here to make this look a bit better. So we'll go to Alt-C for category, A for accounting. Then I'll change the decimal places to 0 right here. And I can also change the name of this. Alt-C, go to custom, and I can just call this total custom, total invoice amount instead. Now we see that the name has changed and the formatting here also looks much better. And similarly, if we're doing anything else with a pivot table, typically the best way to format a pivot table is to go to the cell that you want to format and then go to options right here under pivot table tools and then go to field settings and then go to number format here at the bottom with Alt-N. And that lets you just get a lot more control. So I could go in here and change this to accounting with 0 decimal places, for example. Then go to OK. You could go in and just highlight everything and try to format it, but it's a bad idea because with a pivot table, you're always moving around the fields and the data and everything. So if we were to change this, and let's say I drag price over to the right side of the screen, then if we had just formatted it manually rather than formatting the fields themselves, then it wouldn't show up correctly, so we'd have a problem. So that's why it's typically better to format pivot tables by going to field settings instead. But those are the basics of how you set up a very simple pivot table like this. And you can see how you move around the data, how you move around the different categories. There are some people who are really, really good with pivot tables, and they can apply all sorts of tricks. They can do all sorts of fancy things with them. But for the most part in investment banking, you're usually doing pretty simple things like this, like looking at customer data by price, by industry, by customer name, that sort of stuff. So I'm just going to focus on the fundamentals behind pivot tables and then go through an example with you now of how you'd actually use it in a real world situation. So now that you know how to create your own pivot table, how to modify it by changing around the field list and by dragging around the data by changing the formatting, I'm going to go into an example of how we would actually use this to solve a real world problem, which is to figure out how much each customer owes us over a given period. So the first thing I'll do here is just press Alt-EL to delete this whole worksheet because we don't want to even bother with this anymore. We just want to get rid of it. So Alt-EL, delete that. And so I'm going to go through this exercise first myself without giving you the shortcut keys. And then honestly, with pivot tables, there isn't too much in the way of shortcut keys to learn because you actually use the mouse quite a lot to move around the data. So there isn't a whole lot to learn there, but I'm going to go through this the first time and then we'll go through the same exercise where you'll pause the video, try it yourself, and then I'll go through it again more slowly and with more of an explanation this time. So once again, I'm going to select everything here, go to pivot table, go through all these options, make sure new worksheet is selected. What I want to do here is first I'm going to select customer name. I'm going to drag this over here. And then for the fields to add to the report, so I want to add invoice amount in the middle right here. See that this has changed now. And I also want to add payment amount also in the middle right here. So now we have the sum of invoice amount and then the sum of payment amount for each of the customers. And so I'm going to leave it like that for now. So this is a pretty simple pivot table. But we're trying to do something that's actually very useful here, and that's something that actually comes up a fair amount when you're using this in investment banking. And so I'm just going to go to formulas right here. And again, in Excel 2003, this will appear on the side of your screen instead. So go to formulas, and I'm going to go to calculated field by pressing F. And so what I want to do here is actually make a calculation to figure out how much each of these customers owes us. So I'm going to call this remaining balance. For the formula, I'm going to press equals, and then I'm going to go down to fields, and I will select invoice amount, and then go to Alt-E to insert the field. Go down to fields again, and then insert payment amount right here, and then press OK. Just press enter to get to that. Okay, so now this tells us basically how much each of these customers owes us. Now, one other thing we could do here to make this a bit easier to read is to change the formatting on each of these different cells. So I'm going to go in and do that right now. So once again, I'm going to go to pivot table options, and then for field settings, I'm going to call this total invoice amount instead. For number format, I'm going to change this to accounting, 0 decimal places. Then I'll do the same for sum of payment amount. Go to field settings and then say total payment amount. Change the formatting of the numbers. And then sum of remaining balance. We can just call this remaining balance. And then once again, just change the formatting right here. So we can just call this total remaining balance. It just gave me an error because our source column remaining balance already exists in this pivot table. So that's one thing to point out, that you can't have duplicate names in a pivot table. So we're just going to call this total remaining balance for now. Okay, so now we see we can quickly look at this and tell that Buster's still owes us money, Cindy's does, Dave's does not, Holly's does. Basically all of them do except for Sydney's and Dave's up here at the top. And you see that we have a summary of the total invoice amount, the total payment amount, and then the total remaining balance of $410,000 here at the bottom. this type of calculation actually comes up a fair amount in investment banking whenever you're looking at customer due diligence data. So it's important to know with pivot tables how to actually go in and add your own calculations, and then of course how to actually drag around the data like we did here. I can just drag this to the left and instantly get different views like that, because you'd be surprised, but a lot of people in finance don't even know how to fully use pivot tables. And I don't even mean the complicated advanced features. I'm talking more about the basic features, the fundamentals that I just went over here. So these are the most important points to keep in mind with pivot tables for Excel in investment banking and private equity. So that's it for the exercise that I went through. So now what I want you to do is go through the same exercise, and I'm going to pause the video, give this a shot yourself. I'm going to go in and delete this entire sheet right now. So go back to this original sheet, go back to the file that's included as part of the course right above the video here, and go in and try to replicate what I just did. So you should pause the video, try to do that, and then if you get stuck or you want to check your work, just unpause it, and then we'll go through it together. Okay, good. So here's what we're going to do to recreate that pivot table and add in those calculations. So first things first, I'm going to select this whole area with Shift Control down and then right. Then Alt D P to go to pivot table. Alt N for next. Alt N for next because this is the correct area. And then we do want to have a new worksheet. I could switch between them with Alt N and Alt E here, but we're just going to go with Alt N for new worksheet for now. Then Alt F for finish. So we have our new worksheet right over here. Now, for the row fields, and again, in Excel 2003, this is going to appear in a dialog box instead, but the concept is the same. So for the row fields, I'm going to take customer name and put it over here on the left, just using the mouse to actually drag that over. And then for the data items, I'm going to take invoice amount and drag it to the center with the left mouse button. Then I'm going to take payment amount and also drag that to the center with the left mouse button there. So now we have our sum of invoice amount and sum of payment amount. It's not formatted and doesn't look pretty yet, but we have our basics in place right here. Now, to actually go in and add this calculation, we want to look at our pivot table tools, and you'll have to click this on the right side of the screen in Excel 2003. In 2007, it's here at the top of the screen under pivot table tools options. But I want to go to formula right here. So I'm going to go to formula. I'll press F to get to calculated field. Now for name, I'm going to change the name here. I'll press Alt N to get to name, by the way. I'll change the name here to total remaining balance. For the formula, I press Alt M to get to that. I'll say equals. I'll press Alt F to get to fields. And I'll go down or press I to get to invoice amount. Press Alt E to insert the field. Press the minus sign. Press Alt F to get back to fields. Press P to get to payment amount. And then Alt E to insert field. And then I will press Enter right here. So here's what we have for our worksheet now, and we're almost done, but we want to change around the formatting to make this look a bit prettier and to let us more easily tell what's a number, how many decimal places they have and everything. So to change this, I'm going to go down using the arrow keys and select one of these actual cells. And under pivot table options, I'm going to go to field settings right here. And for custom name, I'll press Alt C to get to this. And I can call this total invoice amount. Alt N to get to number format. Alt C for category. A for accounting. Alt D to change the decimal places to 0, and then hit OK. And then sum of payment amount, go to field settings again, type total payment amount right here, and then Alt N for number format, Alt C for category, then A for accounting, decimal places, change that to 0 once again. And then finally, for sum of total remaining balance, just go to field settings again. We can call this remaining balance. Alt N to go to number format. Alt C, and then A to go to accounting. Decimal place is already set to 0. Then we'll just hit enter for OK. Okay, and that's that for our table. So now we have a pivot table that lets us easily view the customers and view how much in total each of them has been billed and then how much they've each paid. We can switch around the data by just dragging the data to the left with the mouse, dragging it back to the right if we want to view it like that. And now you should have a basic understanding of how to set up and use pivot tables within Excel. Again, very useful when analyzing data sets, when looking at customer data, customer due diligence, that sort of thing. Not as commonly used with formulas, but you're going to use it all the time when your team asks you to look at data or when the client wants you to look at a certain aspect of your data or figure out some kind of pattern within the data. And that's really what you use pivot tables for. Coming up next, I'm going to be going over the last two remaining features I want to show you in Excel, which are how to set up and record your own macros and then how to set up your own custom keyboard shortcuts in Excel.